The right to vote is one of the most fundamental aspects of any democracy, a pillar upon which the entire system of governance stands. Yet, over the past few years, that right has been under attack, particularly from the political right. Donald Trump, the 45th President of the United States, has been a key figure in pushing the narrative of widespread voter fraud and undermining the trust in American elections. His rhetoric on the issue of election security, particularly in the aftermath of his loss to Joe Biden in the 2020 presidential election, has reached dangerous levels. At a recent event, Donald Trump accepted the Patriot of the Year award, sponsored by Fox News, where he made alarming claims about election fraud. He argued that if he is reelected, he would take extreme steps to limit access to voting, disenfranchising millions of American voters. Specifically, Trump threatened to disenfranchise up to 90 million people, those who voted early, by mail-in ballots, or through absentee voting. This rhetoric, if realized, poses a direct threat to the core values of democracy, including universal suffrage and equal participation. In this video, we will break down Trump's plan to limit voting rights, examine the underlying implications of such policies, and discuss why his proposals are not just a matter of political preference, but a serious threat to the integrity of the American democratic system. The threat to democracy, disenfranchising millions of voters. Donald Trump's rhetoric about the 2020 election has been marked by an incessant and unfounded claim of widespread voter fraud. Despite the lack of credible evidence to support his allegations, Trump has continuously stoked fear about election integrity. According to a report by the Brennan Center for Justice, voter fraud in the United States is a minuscule issue, with a fraud rate of just 0.009% of ballots cast. Yet Trump has leveraged this false narrative to fuel his desire for stricter voting laws that, if enacted, would disproportionately affect millions of voters. In his speech at the Patriot of the Year event, Trump openly declared that he would work to eliminate early voting, mail-in voting, absentee ballots, and other alternative voting methods. According to his plan, only in-person voting on Election Day would be allowed. He argued that this would curb what he describes as election fraud, but in reality, it would do nothing to address the actual issues of fraud, which, as the numbers show, are virtually non-existent. Instead, it would primarily serve to disenfranchise a vast swath of the American electorate, those who rely on early voting, absentee ballots, or mail-in voting for legitimate reasons, including those with disabilities, elderly citizens, and people who live in rural areas. To put things into perspective, the 2020 election saw a record-breaking number of early voters. Approximately 88 million Americans voted early or by mail. Trump's proposals, if enacted, would effectively disenfranchise a large portion of these voters, many of whom had legitimate reasons for voting early. These voters would be forced to vote in person on a single day, a system that disproportionately disadvantages those who face obstacles such as long work hours, lack of transportation, and physical disabilities. The impact of eliminating early and mail-in voting. The proposals to eliminate early and mail-in voting are not just political stances. They are a direct attack on the accessibility of voting, especially for historically marginalized groups. For people with disabilities, early voting provides a crucial opportunity to cast their ballots without the barriers that a single-day Election Day voting system would create. Similarly, people living in rural areas or those who work long hours may find it difficult, if not impossible, to vote on Election Day. Trump's attempt to roll back these options is part of a broader strategy to restrict access to the ballot box. In many states, early voting has been shown to increase voter participation, especially among groups like Black and Latino voters. According to research, early voting allows people to plan their participation, reduces long lines at polling stations, and makes it easier for those with limited resources or mobility to vote. If early and mail-in voting were to be eliminated, these groups would be disproportionately affected, leading to lower voter turnout in these communities. Furthermore, Trump's proposal to push for one-day voting and paper ballots ignores the realities of modern elections. While paper ballots are still used in many states, Trump's proposal to return to a completely paper-based system, while eliminating the convenience and accessibility of mail-in ballots, would only serve to slow down the voting process and create confusion. It would disproportionately affect those who have limited access to transportation, as well as the elderly and disabled who may have difficulty making it to the polling stations. The voter ID debate, a tool for voter suppression. In addition to his push to eliminate early voting, Trump has also been an advocate for strict voter ID laws. While voter ID might sound like a reasonable request on the surface, it's important to recognize that the argument for voter ID is often used as a cover for voter suppression. In many states, people are already required to present identification during voter registration, and those found to be committing voter fraud face severe penalties. The idea that voter fraud is rampant, something Trump and other Republicans claim, is simply not supported by the data. As mentioned earlier, studies show that the rate of voter fraud in the United States is infinitesimally small. The 2020 election saw only 12 verified cases of voter fraud in Georgia, a state with over 5 million voters. However, voter ID laws have been shown to disproportionately affect minority voters, low-income individuals, and people with disabilities. These groups are less likely to have access to the specific forms of ID that many states require. For example, a significant portion of the population does not have a driver's license, and obtaining one can be difficult for people living in poverty or in rural areas with limited access to government offices. By pushing for voter ID laws, Trump and other Republicans aim to create additional barriers for these vulnerable groups, effectively suppressing the vote. The need for voter ID on Election Day would slow down the voting process, create confusion, and, most importantly, prevent certain groups of people from casting their ballots. It is clear that the goal of these laws is not to ensure election integrity, but to limit access to the vote for specific segments of the population that are more likely to vote Democratic. Voter suppression versus voter integrity, the Republican strategy. The concept of voter integrity is often invoked by Republicans when they push for stricter voting laws. However, what they are really advocating for is voter suppression. The measures they propose, such as eliminating early voting, restricting mail-in ballots, and implementing stringent voter ID laws, are designed to make it harder for people, especially those in Democratic strongholds, to vote. Voter suppression has been a central theme of Republican electoral strategy in recent years. By limiting access to the ballot box, Republicans can effectively reduce voter turnout, particularly in urban areas, where large numbers of Democratic voters live. Studies have shown that voter suppression disproportionately impacts Black and Latino voters, as well as young people and low-income individuals. These are groups that tend to vote Democratic, and suppressing their vote can help Republicans maintain power, even if their policies do not have majority support. By framing these measures as election integrity reforms, Republicans are able to disguise their true intentions, reducing the number of votes cast in Democratic-leaning areas, particularly in swing states. This strategy undermines the very concept of democracy, where every citizen is supposed to have an equal opportunity to participate in the electoral process. The national debate on voter rights and democracy. Trump's rhetoric and proposed policies have sparked a broader national debate about voting rights and the future of American democracy. While Trump supporters argue that these measures are necessary to ensure the integrity of the electoral process, the overwhelming evidence points to the fact that these laws are not necessary at all. Voter fraud, in its rarest forms, does not impact election outcomes in any significant way. What actually impacts elections is voter suppression, the systematic efforts to make it harder for certain groups of people to vote. It is crucial that we, as a society, recognize these efforts for what they are, an attack on democracy itself. Voter suppression is not about ensuring the fairness of elections. It is about maintaining power by any means necessary. Donald Trump's plan to disenfranchise millions of voters is a direct threat to the democratic principles that this country was founded upon. Donald Trump's ongoing efforts to undermine the integrity of American elections and disenfranchise millions of voters are a dangerous step toward eroding the very foundation of democracy. His proposals to eliminate early voting, restrict mail-in ballots, and impose strict voter ID laws are not only unnecessary, but also harmful to our democratic system. They disproportionately affect marginalized groups, including people with disabilities, low-income individuals, and people of color, those who have historically faced barriers to voting. The fight for voting rights is not over. We must remain vigilant in protecting the right to vote for every American citizen, regardless of their race, income, or ability. We cannot allow Donald Trump and his allies to push their agenda of voter suppression. Instead, we must work to expand access to the ballot box, ensuring that every eligible voter has an equal opportunity to participate in our democracy. As citizens, it is our duty to stand up for the right to vote, to fight against voter suppression, and to demand fair and accessible elections for all. The future of our democracy depends on it.